Welcome to another episode of Pacific Matters. My name is Tomas Maglonia. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight we're reporting from the island of Saipan. We got a chance to sit down first with longtime Pacific journalist and photographer Floyd Takeuchi, who returned to Saipan to share a bit of his life's work. We got to ask him about his ties to the Pacific and what he looks for in a photo. Take a listen. And now we're joined with longtime writer photographer in the Pacific and really across the region, Floyd Takeuchi. Floyd, thanks so much for joining us. I know you just returned to Hawaii from a presentation in the NMI. What are some of your reflections coming back home and visiting the NMI? When was your last visit to the NMI?
Well, unfortunately, it's been about 7 years since I was last there, so it was wonderful to be back. Some things about Saipan never change, and some things change a lot. So it was a mix of feeling very comfortable and very much at home, and feeling and a few times wondering where the hell I was. So it was an interesting trip.
And I'm curious, wanted to follow up, what has changed and what hasn't in your view?
Well, I think after the super typhoons, the number of buildings that have been abandoned by their owners just seem to be everywhere, and a real eyesore on a very beautiful island. It makes for a very desolate scene there. It makes you wonder about the future of the island. But once you start talking with people and meeting with people, things go very well.
And for those who know you and your work, you've worked for the past 48 years. Your journalism career on Saipan began in 1974.
That's correct.
And you returned for a presentation, an illustrated presentation called Tropical Light. For those who weren't able to go to the museum to watch your presentation, can you explain what your presentation was about?
Tropical Light is a compilation of the work I've been doing since pretty much 2010. When I left corporate journalism and management, I was president of one of the media companies in Hawaii, and doing work in the region. And to do be on my own, to use photography as a means to tell stories, Pacific stories that I thought were important and should be told. It's not necessarily the quickest way to make money, but it's been a lot more personally satisfying. My goals were to tell stories that need to be told, to focus on the beauty of the region, both the physical as well as the cultural beauty, and to tell that story in an effective way, so that others who are not familiar with the region can learn to appreciate the region too.
And why do you choose this particular medium of photography and journalism to capture the stories of the Pacific? Can you tell us a bit about your thought process going through that?
Sure. A good part of my career has been what was as a reporter, a writer, or an editor, or a publisher. And so dealing with words primarily, or the packaging of words and photographs in some media, usually print. But I've been a photographer for personal goals mostly since I was 10. That's in 1963, so it's quite a while. And it was a chance to just use a different medium to tell the stories that I've been trying to tell throughout my career. I've been very fortunate in my career to have reported stories such as the second evacuation of Bikini in '78, the political status negotiations that led to independence in Micronesia, the Marshalls and Palau, and Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, as well as more contemporary stories through the last couple of decades. So it's been a challenge, but so far quite successful. I've had 6 shows in Tokyo, Japan, also called Tropical Light, focusing on the FSM, and I had a show in Pohnpei, 10, actually close to 15 shows in Honolulu, most of them solo shows for the work. And it's ranged from my documentary work in Chuk at Xavier High School to what would be called fine arts photographs from around the region.
Welcome back. Here's more of our interview with Floyd. And you mentioned the political status of the different nations in Micronesia, and Floyd Takeuchi is not exactly a local name you would find in the islands. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were born and raised in the Marshall Islands, and actually your parents were both employed by the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. And so
That's correct.
Draw out a little bit of your connection to the Pacific and why you decided to stay.
Well, as you said, I was born and raised in the Marshall Islands on Majuro in the 50s. In those days, there were somewhere on the order of about 2,000 people on Majuro compared to the 30 some thousand there are today. And it was a very different place, great place to grow up. My folks went to the mainland for 4 years and then went back to Saipan in '64. And were there until '82. I started working on Saipan, as you mentioned, in '74 as an intern, and then made the choice when I went to graduate school right after I got my undergraduate degree at Boston University in 1975, and it was at the University of Hawaii Pacific Island Studies, and also at the East-West Center. And pretty much made the conscious choice from 1974 on that my career would be pretty much based in the Pacific, and in the Pacific, primarily in the Micronesia region. I did run a newspaper in Fiji for a while in the '90s as managing editor. But other than that, and some time in Washington, D.C. for member of Congress, and some time in Tokyo as a foreign correspondent, and pretty much either in Hawaii or the islands.
And what is it about the Pacific? I don't know if the correct question is what's unique about the Pacific, but do you have a view on that? Why Pacific stories are worth telling?
I like the people. I like the cultures. I think the stories need to be told. They're usually told by journalists who drop in and leave fairly quickly. Well, I drop in also on occasion, as I did on Saipan on this most recent trip. I do have some longevity and memory, and I can sort of connect the dots a little bit more easily in a way that I think tells the story from a local perspective more effectively than some others can.
And are you able to share what the composition of your photography is like? Or what do you look for in an image?
I look for, that's actually a very good question. And it's very personal. You just kind of know when you see it. But I look for, all photographers look first for light. What's the light like? And is it dramatic? Is it contrasty? Does it have warmth? Is it cool? And then you start building the image in your mind from that. You do video. I'm sure you do the same thing. We all need light. Photography, of course, means painting with light. So we look for the light to be a big part of the story, and then from there we build it. It can be very different, whether it's a landscape or a seascape photograph. I did a project in Chuk for a commission for a new hotel that was being built there about 10 years ago, and they flew me down to Chuk for about 2 weeks, and I shot to my heart's content. Beautiful images, and but I also like to do portrait work, and so there was this most recent trip on Saipan. one of our videographers who I was working with for another project had an assistant who was his girlfriend, who was this very strikingly beautiful young lady. And we were inside a restaurant that we had taken over for a shoot. And I just asked her if I could take her photograph, and posed her in a couple simple positions with the light particularly nice, and got a very striking image. That was just on a quick grab shot, but it turned out very nicely.
Welcome back to Pacific Matters. We wrap up our interview with Floyd, who shares what's in store in his plans for the future. What projects are you working on right now, or what can some people who are watching this expect to see from you in the future?
Well, I've been doing quite a bit of work in the Marshall Islands, and had a very large commission there until COVID came along, and the pandemic pretty much took care of that project. And that was to do portraits of about 50 master weavers. The Marshallese weaving tradition is one of the best in the Pacific, as I'm sure you know. And we had my project partner, a local gal, and I had 50 master weavers lined up, and we do portraits of them for both a show and a book to help to tell that story. And that's an important story to tell, because weaving is what helps define traditionally the role of women in society, and the master weavers are really, really good. Many of them, however, are leaving the Marshalls as part of the diaspora that's quickly draining the country's population, moving to places like Springdale, Arkansas, and Bend, Oregon, and where it's harder to find materials, the bandanas with coconut that they use for weaving. So I thought it was important to tell that story. I hope to revive that. I do have 2 other projects that have been approved for the Marshalls and funded. One of them is a guide for the government for tourism. It's a pretty small industry there, but I hope to get to work on that project as soon as they open the country's borders. They're still closed. There's another project that I've been planning in the Marshalls, which is a very big one. We're not sure if we can get the funding for it, but it's basically to take a crew of photographers, myself and 2 others, down to the Marshalls to document every island and atoll in the country, 33 altogether, so that when climate change does its thing and islands and atolls start disappearing, there will be a collective memory for the Marshallese people of what their country looked like. And I hope that we can do that one possibly next year.
And Floyd, just my last question is, there might be some young budding journalists or photographers or both watching this. Do you have any words of advice for young people in the Pacific wanting to have as long and as rich of a history of work that you do?
Well, I would just encourage them to follow their dreams. I'm glad to see that you're a good example of locals who are going into journalism to tell the people's own stories. When I was coming up the ranks, there were very few folks from Northern Marianas who were actually in journalism, just 1 or 2, and they ended up going off into primarily a government public affairs work. We still find very few in the islands who are, the North Pacific in particular, who are going to journalism. I'm involved with a new group in the Marshall Islands called the Pacific Media Institute, and which is part of the mission of that is to train Marshallese to tell their own story. And so it's hard being a photographer these days. Everyone's a photographer with a good iPhone, but the local perspective needs to be told, and I hope we see much more of that activity in the coming years.
All right, Floyd, that's all the questions I had. Is there anything else you'd like to add or touch on that I didn't ask about?
I think I appreciate your interest in my work. Uh, the test of whether I'm successful or not is whether the local communities tell me I am. And so far, I've been very fortunate that the local reaction has been very positive. I'm not trying to ignore the parts of life in the islands that are tough or difficult, but I've done that a lot in my career as a writer, and hopefully can focus on the beauty part of it for the remainder of my career.
All right, Floyd, thank you so much, and hope to be in touch. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for the interest. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Floyd for sharing his work and his time with us. When we come back after the break, we've got a roundup of some good news coming out of the CNMI. Welcome back to Pacific Matters. In our next story, we have some good news. It's a $2 million award to one agency tasked with repairing a much-needed project in the heart of Saipan's tourist district. Here's more.
This is a huge project. This is a major part of our economic hub, this particular area, and this will help and obviously prove the support for economic growth and development as we move forward.
$2 million of federal ARPA funds are being pumped into the design and construction of the Garpan sewer line replacement at the heart of Saipan's tourist district.
We're moving forward with this. Garpan is our central, and a lot of business we definitely will appreciate this.
As the island recovers from the pandemic's blow, officials say this part of the project was essential to flush out now before other major developments in the village.
There were overlapping between projects, and this is one of them. And that is one of the reasons why we pushed this project ahead of most projects, simply because there were overlaps in the Garpan revitalization project.
This is one of the first checks cut out by the newly minted Infrastructure Recovery Program, who's assisting in distributing the federal funds across the government.
Counting the days down, now that we've handed the check over to when CUC will officially complete it, and we look forward to that, Gary. When handling the check is one day, but the greatest impact is when it's completed and the people are able to realize the upgrades of infrastructure in the Garpan area.
And in our next story, over 50 students are now back home in Saipan, Tinian, and Rota with trophies in hand after dominating a national drill meet in California. Here's that story.
We weren't expecting anything, but just to see that, some of our hard work paid off was just awesome.
Over 50 student cadets from Saipan, Tinian, and Rota saw that hard work translate to the 16 trophies they brought home after fierce competition at the Golden Bear West Coast National Drill Meet in California.
Once you kind of just go into the mindset where you can just have fun and experience something outside of your borders, you can do wonders with that.
The NMI's high schools took the top spot in the Army's Traveling Trophy and Unarmed Novice Exhibition category, surpassing over 20 stateside school drill teams.
It really depends on the team, how hard and committed they are. If they're committed and they believe and work hard, they'll definitely win.
This was the first time all public high schools in the NMI competed in the annual tilt across the unarmed, armed, color guard, and saber competitions.
Beyond than just performing well in the competition, this was a proving point to them that even though that we are a speck on the globe, they can go out and represent internationally, globally. So getting them to see beyond the shores of the Marianas has been a really good experience for them.
And before we wrap up the show, the annual Flametree Arts Festival finally made its return after 2 years to Saipan because of the pandemic. Here are some sights and sounds.
And our theme, Healing Through Arts, is part of the island healing process.
Over the past weekend, the CNMI marked its 39th, 40th, and 41st Flametree Arts Festival. It's a return to a normal tradition in the new normal as COVID-19 cases remain relatively low on Saipan. Food, family, and performances filled the Sugar King Park.
In addition to the arts and crafts and performers, we have a sizable delegation from the island of Rota that includes practitioners of traditional medicine, bringing with them some of the local medicine used to heal common ailment.
It's a sign of the times as crowds gathered closer than ever since 2020 and roamed festival grounds over 3 days last weekend.
But just coming together as a community once again to celebrate and enjoy the arts, the food, and each other's company is healing for the body, mind, and soul. We are back. Woo!
The festival opened by honoring longtime traditional practitioners and island artists who also brought colorful displays filling the festival grounds.
With today's healing through arts, to the families that are up here, I just wanted to share how blessed you are to be able to enjoy a family member with such talent.
That theme, a reminder as vaccines do their work in the seemingly now new normal, healing. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of Pacific Matters. My name is Tomas Manglona, and we will see you right here next week.